The war began not with a grand declaration, but with a series of subtle incursions along the outer colonies of human space, areas that the Galactic Coalition deemed insignificant and poorly defended, and at first the humans appeared passive, almost submissive, as alien ships with shimmering hulls of iridescent metal scanned their settlements and issued demands that no human government would have ever considered reasonable. Yet the human leaders, veterans of countless conflicts on a planet that had never surrendered, quietly mobilized fleets in hidden sectors, stockpiled weapons of unprecedented sophistication, and coordinated strategies across star systems using communication networks encrypted beyond alien comprehension, while the alien commanders, arrogant in their assumptions of superiority, underestimated every signal they ignored, every patrol they dismissed, and every diplomat they brushed aside, convinced that humanity would crumble under the psychological weight of their interstellar armada and advanced technology. Yet humanity had learned through centuries of struggle that survival required cunning patience and a willingness to exploit the enemy's hubris. And so the first strike was almost invisible, a single human cruiser disguised as a merchant vessel that slipped past the alien blockade to deliver a payload capable of disabling a major warship in the Coalition's fleet. The effect was catastrophic, leaving alien officers scrambling to comprehend how a civilization they considered primitive had breached their defenses with such precision, and as the humans observed from safe distances, they noted the growing panic, the miscommunication, and the over-reliance on technology that lacked the adaptability of human ingenuity. And over the next weeks, the humans executed a series of tactical maneuvers that seemed small in isolation, but compounded into an unstoppable chain reaction of failures across the alien command structure, from asteroid belt, ambushes that exploited the gravitational anomalies humans had studied for decades, to coordinated boarding actions that neutralized ship crews without unnecessary destruction, to cyber operations that turned alien AI against its masters, and all the while the humans maintained their composure, their civilians contributing through manufacturing, intelligence gathering, and even direct combat in ways that the aliens could not anticipate. While back in the council chambers of Galactic Coalition, debates raged over whether the humans had obtained some secret technology or whether their victories would result of sheer luck. Yet each council member, no matter how powerful, began to feel the creeping sense of dread that humanity was no longer the underestimated species they had dismissed as a curiosity or a nuisance. And within the first month of open hostilities, entire fleets found themselves unable to navigate through space corridors that humans had mapped with uncanny precision. Supply lines were severed, communications jammed, and morale plummeted as reports arrived of alien ships vanishing without a trace, only to have survivors return with tales of humans appearing where no one expected, striking with speed and decisiveness, using tactics that seemed reckless but were calculated to exploit every weakness. And amid all this, the humans maintained strict discipline, refusing to overextend, always retreating when necessary to lure alien forces into traps. Meticulously laid out across star systems that humans had colonized generations before and studied in minute detail, and as the aliens tried to regroup, they discovered that humans had been observing them for decades, learning patterns, behaviors, strengths, and weaknesses, cataloging everything to the point where every decision the Coalition made played directly into human hands. And when the first major battle erupted near the Orion cluster, it was a turning point, as humans launched a coordinated assault using decoy fleets, orbital bombardments timed with precision strikes on command centers, and boarding teams that disabled the alien ships from the inside, while alien leaders scrambled to respond. And by the end of the engagement, what had seemed an overwhelming force to any observer had been shattered, with the aliens unable to comprehend how a supposedly primitive species had orchestrated such a complete and devastating defeat. And as reports of the battle spread across human space, a surge of pride and determination filled every colony, every ship, and every soldier, as they realized that the galaxy had misjudged them, that the human spirit, honed through millennia of struggle on a harsh planet, coupled with ingenuity, coordination, and relentless willpower, could topple even the most confident alien civilizations. And this was only the beginning, as humans began to take the fight deeper into alien space, striking supply hubs, research stations, and political centers with surgical precision, while simultaneously defending their own territories with layered strategies that frustrated even the most experienced alien admirals. and the psychological impact on the coalition was immense. As alien populations began to question their leaders' competence, alliances frayed under the stress of repeated defeats, and humans exploited these divisions, sowing confusion through misinformation, strategic feints, and targeted sabotage that left aliens turning on each other even as humans advanced relentlessly. And in these early stages of the war, it became clear that humanity's advantage was not in brute force alone, but in adaptability, creativity, and the ability to make decisions that were unpredictable, counterintuitive, and entirely human, such that even when the aliens anticipated one move, the humans had already anticipated the counter to the counter, and the contingency after that, creating a chain of actions that left the coalition reeling, unable to stabilize, while humans maintained clarity of purpose, their leaders demonstrating a combination of courage, strategic brilliance, and emotional intelligence that ensured cohesion across the species even as they faced the might of multiple galactic civilizations. And as months passed, reports of alien fleets being ambushed, cut off, or tricked multiplied, showing humans striking in ways that no theoretical model could have predicted, from using natural cosmic phenomena like gravity wells, solar flares, and asteroid fields to enhance their attacks, to leveraging cultural and psychological insights gleaned from intercepted communications to manipulate alien behavior, to executing multi-system operations that coordinated thousands of ships, soldiers, and civilians in a seamless display of strategy and timing. And through all of this, humans preserved their moral code, often giving aliens a chance to surrender or retreat before striking, which only increased alien bewilderment at humanity's combination of ferocity and restraint, as well as the growing reputation of humans as both honorable and terrifying adversaries. And this perception alone began to change the nature of negotiations, alliances, and even internal alien politics, as factions in the coalition argued over whether to continue fighting, attempt diplomacy, or flee. And yet humans pressed forward, never showing weakness, always adapting, always striking at the precise moment that maximized effect, until the coalition realized that what they had assumed would be a quick conquest had instead become a slow, relentless, and inescapable unraveling of their power structure at the hands of a species they had dismissed as inconsequential. And as the first year of war drew to a close, humans had not only survived, but had established control over critical regions, demonstrated overwhelming tactical brilliance, and instilled fear across the galaxy, proving that the war the aliens thought they would win was, in fact, a testament to human resilience, intelligence, and the unstoppable drive to protect and expand their place in the universe, setting the stage for a conflict that would be remembered for generations as the moment the galaxy underestimated humanity at its peril. The Coalition's first real attempt to reassert control came when they deployed 3 converging battle groups toward the Helios Corridor, a region of space that connected 12 major human systems and carried nearly a third of all civilian and military traffic. And to the alien high command, it appeared to be the perfect place to deliver a crushing blow that would sever humanity's logistical spine and force a rapid surrender. But what they did not understand was that the Helios Corridor had been studied, mapped, simulated, and war-gamed by human strategists for over a century, not because it was their most valuable route, but because it was their most dangerous, a natural bottleneck filled with unstable stellar radiation, dense debris fields from ancient supernovae, and unpredictable gravitational tides that shifted like slow, invisible oceans. And while the aliens saw only a straight line between 2 clusters, humans saw a living environment that could be turned into a weapon. And as the Coalition fleets advanced in rigid formation, relying on automated navigation and centralized command protocols, human sensor arrays hidden inside civilian stations and deep space research platforms began feeding real-time data to a distributed network of tacticians who operated not from a single command center, but from dozens of hardened nodes scattered across multiple systems, each one capable of making independent decisions if cut off, ensuring that no single strike could decapitate human leadership. And among those coordinating the defense was a veteran fleet commander named Daniel Carter, a man in his late 50s whose career had been built not on spectacular victories, but on a reputation for never losing a ship unnecessarily. A commander who believed that wars were won not by the most powerful weapons, but by the side that understood time, space, and human behavior better than the enemy. And it was Carter who authorized the first phase of what would later be known as the Helios Trap, a plan that did not seek to meet the Coalition head-on, but to let them advance, to let them feel confident, to let them commit fully before revealing that every kilometer they traveled was being measured, predicted, and quietly prepared for their destruction. And so human fleets appeared to retreat, abandoning outlying stations, pulling patrols back, allowing alien scouts to report that resistance was disorganized and falling back toward the inner systems. Exactly the picture the Coalition expected to see from a species, finally realizing the scale of the force arrayed against it. And this apparent withdrawal drew the alien armadas deeper into the corridor, where the radiation storms began to interfere with their long-range sensors, forcing them to rely more heavily on their automated prediction systems, which had never been trained to account for a thinking enemy that would deliberately manipulate the environment rather than simply fight within it. As the first alien ships crossed the threshold marked only on human maps, Carter gave the order to initiate Phase 2, and dozens of small, unremarkable objects that had been drifting in the corridor for years suddenly came alive, revealing themselves as human drones and stealth platforms that activated in perfect synchronization, projecting false sensor echoes, phantom fleets, and distorted gravitational signatures that made the corridor appear far more stable and empty ahead than it truly was, luring the alien commanders to increase speed and tighten formation to maintain control, a decision that would soon prove catastrophic, because the tighter their formation, the less room they had to maneuver when the first of the human-engineered gravity pulses rippled through the region, subtle at first, barely detectable, but enough to shift the trajectories of asteroids and debris fields that had been carefully nudged into precarious orbits over the previous months by unmanned human tugs. And as those masses began to drift across the Coalition's path, human strike groups that had been hiding in the shadows of nearby stars and behind dense radiation clouds surged forward, not in a single overwhelming wave, but in dozens of small, fast-moving formations that struck at the edges of the alien fleets, targeting sensor ships, communication relays, and command vessels, never staying long enough to be fully engaged, then vanishing back into the environmental chaos they understood. And the aliens did not. And the result was confusion. As alien admirals struggled to maintain situational awareness, their centralized command structures issuing orders that arrived late or were contradicted by local conditions, while human units operated on mission-based directives, each captain and squad leader empowered to adapt in real time, to exploit opportunities without waiting for permission. And in one such engagement, a human destroyer group led by Captain Laura Mitchell, a former test pilot turned combat commander, executed a maneuver that would later be studied in academies across multiple species, using a combination of micro-jumps and radiation shadowing to appear inside the sensor blind spot of an alien carrier group, launching boarding pods and precision strikes that disabled the carrier's propulsion and power systems in under 2 minutes, then withdrawing before the main alien force could respond, leaving behind a drifting hulk and thousands of stunned crew who had never imagined that humans could penetrate their defenses so cleanly. And as similar actions unfolded across the corridor, the Coalition's carefully planned advance began to fracture into a series of isolated, desperate battles, each one fought under conditions that favored the humans more and more, because every explosion, every shifting mass of debris, every burst of radiation altered the environment in ways that human models could rapidly adapt to and exploit, while alien systems, optimized for stable, predictable engagements, lagged behind reality. And Carter, observing the unfolding chaos from his command node, did not order a general attack. Instead, he waited, allowing the pressure to build, knowing that the true breaking point would come not from physical losses alone, but from the psychological realization among alien commanders that they no longer controlled the battle space. And that moment arrived when a Coalition flagship, attempting to reassert command by moving to a central position in the formation, triggered a chain reaction of gravitational disturbances that humans had been patiently setting up, causing 2 massive debris fields to converge, not in a random collision, but in a precisely timed compression that generated shock waves strong enough to cripple multiple capital ships and disrupt communications across an entire sector. And as alarms echoed through alien bridges and damage reports flooded in, human fleets that had been holding back finally emerged in force, not as a single monolithic armada, but as a coordinated web of task groups that struck simultaneously from multiple vectors, overwhelming point defenses, isolating ships, and forcing surrender after surrender, while human marines boarded, secured, and captured vessels with disciplined efficiency. treating prisoners according to strict codes even as the battle raged around them, reinforcing the growing realization among the Coalition that they were not facing chaotic savages but a species that combined ruthless effectiveness with structured restraint. And by the time the radiation storms began to subside and the true scale of the engagement became clear, the Helios Corridor was no longer a path of advance for the Coalition, but a graveyard of disabled and captured ships, a region firmly under human control. And news of the defeat spread rapidly through alien space, carried by survivors whose accounts of human tactics, coordination, and environmental mastery challenged long-held assumptions about human inferiority, sowing doubt among political leaders and fear among military planners, because it was now undeniable that humanity was not merely resisting, but shaping the war itself, choosing where and how the fighting would occur, and forcing the Coalition to react to a tempo and style of combat it had never prepared for, a realization that marked the true beginning of the shift in the balance of power. As the war the aliens thought they would win began, slowly but inexorably, to turn against them, the shock of the Helios Corridor defeat rippled to the Coalition like a seismic wave, not only because of the material losses, but because of what it revealed about the nature of the enemy they had misjudged, and in the high chambers of the Galactic Council, where representatives of dozens of species gathered beneath vast crystalline arches and holographic star maps, the tone shifted from confidence to unease as analysts presented data showing patterns of human behavior that defied conventional models of warfare, demonstrating an ability to learn in real time, to decentralize command without losing cohesion, and to exploit both physical and psychological weaknesses with unsettling precision. And while some council members argue for overwhelming retaliation, for the deployment of their most devastating weapons in a single crushing blow that would end the conflict through sheer force, others, more cautious and more attentive to reports from the front, warned that such an approach played directly into human strengths, that escalation without understanding would only deepen the trap, yet the Coalition was bound by political inertia and pride. And so a compromise was reached, a new campaign would be launched, one designed not merely to destroy human fleets, but to break their will by targeting the symbols of their unity and resilience, their core worlds, their shipyards, their academies, and their centers of governance. And the spearhead of this campaign was to be a massive multi-species armada under the command and experience but rigid admiral named Kara Voss, a being whose species valued hierarchy and strict adherence to doctrine above all else, and who believed that the chaos of the Helios engagement had been an anomaly that could be corrected by tighter control and overwhelming concentration of force. And so Voss assembled his fleets along the frontier of human space, bringing together warships of many designs, some ancient and heavily armored, others sleek and bristling with advanced energy weapons, all unified under a centralized command network that funneled decisions upward and expected flawless compliance downward. And opposite this looming presence, humanity did not respond with a single grand fleet of its own, instead dispersing its forces, reinforcing key systems, hardening civilian infrastructure, and quietly evacuating non-essential populations from regions that intelligence suggested would soon become battlefields. And among those overseeing these preparations was a civilian leader named Helen Brooks, a former logistics director who had been appointed to coordinate interstellar resource flow during the crisis, and whose calm, methodical approach ensured that shipyards received raw materials on time, that medical facilities were stocked, and that communication networks remained resilient even under electronic attack. And it was through such unglamorous but vital efforts that humanity maintained the foundation of its war effort, enabling its military commanders to plan boldly, knowing that the systems behind them would not collapse under strain. And as Voss's armada advanced, it encountered what appeared to be a thin screen of human defenses, small patrol groups, isolated stations, and a handful of major fleet elements positioned in what seemed to be predictable defensive orbits and interpreting. This is confirmation that the Helios loss had forced humans onto the defensive. Voss ordered a direct assault, confident that his superior numbers and firepower would sweep aside resistance and open the way to the inner systems. But once again, the apparent simplicity of the situation masked layers of preparation, because the regions he was entering were not merely defended. They were instrumented, saturated with sensor arrays, autonomous platforms, and prepositioned assets that fed an ever-growing stream of data into human command networks, allowing strategists to build a dynamic, evolving picture of the battlefield that updated not by the hour but by the second, and when the first major engagement erupted near a system anchored by a blue-white star and surrounded by dense planetary rings, the humans did not attempt to hold a static line, instead executing a series of elastic defenses, allowing alien forces to advance, then counterattacking their flanks, their supply lines, and their rear elements with rapid strikes that forced Voss to divert ships from a main thrust to protect vulnerable points, gradually stretching his formations and diluting the very concentration of force he relied upon. And in one such action, a human task force led by Commander Richard Hale, a former submarine officer whose experience in confined, sensor-limited environments had shaped his approach to space combat, used the complex gravitational fields of the ring system to mask their movements, slipping through gaps in alien patrol patterns and emerging unexpectedly behind a group of coalition cruisers, disabling them with coordinated volleys and precision electronic warfare before fading back into cluttered environment. And each of these actions, while small compared to the scale of the Armada, forced the coalition to react, to commit escorts, to slow its advance, and most importantly, to question its assumptions, because the humans were not behaving like a cornered species. They were maneuvering, probing, and shaping the engagement, dictating tempo and forcing the initiative back into their own hands. And as weeks of skirmishes and localized battles accumulated, Voss found himself increasingly constrained by the limitations of his centralized command structure, with orders taking longer to propagate, subordinate commanders hesitant to act without approval, and opportunities slipping away because the humans moved faster than the coalition's decision-making cycle. And in contrast, human units operated with shared intent rather than rigid instructions, their captains and ground commanders understanding the broader objectives and free to adapt their methods to local conditions, creating a fluid, responsive web of actions that no single alien commander could fully anticipate or counter. And the psychological strain on the coalition crews grew as well, as rumors spread of human boarding actions that neutralized ships without destroying them, of prisoners treated with a mixture of firmness and unexpected respect, of interrogations that focused not on intimidation, but on understanding, extracting patterns and insights that fed back into human planning. And this combination of relentless pressure, adaptability, and disciplined conduct began to erode the confidence of alien forces who had expected a short, decisive campaign. And when at last Voss attempted to force a breakthrough by concentrating his remaining strength for a direct assault on a heavily fortified human shipyard system, he found that the humans had anticipated this move as well, preparing layered defenses that integrated orbital platforms, mobile fleets, and ground-based energy arrays into a unified network capable of shifting fire and support wherever needed. And as the first waves of the coalition attack were repulsed with heavy losses, it became clear to observers on both sides that the war was entering a new phase, one in which the aliens were no longer advancing into weakness, but into a depth of preparation, resilience, and strategic coherence that they had never expected to face, and that the question was no longer whether humanity could survive, but how far its reach and influence would extend as it continued to adapt, learn, and assert itself against a coalition that was beginning, slowly and painfully, to realize the magnitude of its miscalculation, as the failed assault on the shipyard system reverberated through coalition space. The political unity that had once seemed unshakable began to show visible fractures, because every member species had entered the war believing it would be brief, decisive, and largely fought on the periphery, and now they were faced with rising casualty reports, escalating resource demands, and the uncomfortable truth that the humans were not only holding their own, but were increasingly dictating the terms of engagement. And in closed sessions of the Council, voices that had once spoken with confidence now argue with urgency, some demanding total mobilization and the release of strategic weapons that had not been used in generations, others warning that such escalation would provoke responses from humanity that could destabilize entire regions of the galaxy. And while these debates raged, human intelligence services monitored every shift in coalition rhetoric and posture, piecing together a picture of internal discord that offered new opportunities to apply pressure not just on the battlefield, but in the political and economic spheres as well. And it was during this period that a human diplomatic mission, led by Ambassador Samuel Wright, was dispatched to several neutral and loosely aligned systems, not to plead for aid in the traditional sense, but to present a carefully curated record of human conduct in the war, emphasizing their adherence to codes of treatment for prisoners, their efforts to minimize civilian harm, and their willingness to negotiate in good faith, a contrast deliberately drawn against the coalition's earlier coercive demands and heavy-handed military actions. And this approach began to bear fruit, as smaller powers, wary of being drawn into a widening conflict quietly, opened channels of communication with humanity, sharing information, granting limited access to ports and resupply points, and in some cases, providing technological insights that complemented human research, creating a web of informal cooperation that further strengthened humanity's strategic position. And on the military front, the humans continue to refine their methods, integrating lessons from each engagement into updated doctrines that were disseminated across the fleet with remarkable speed, a process overseen by analysts and trainers who worked around the clock to ensure that even newly commissioned crews understood not only what tactics to use, but why they were effective, fostering a culture of critical thinking and initiative that contrasted sharply with the coalition's more rigid training regimes. And one of the most significant developments of this phase was the emergence of joint human operations that seamlessly combined space, orbital, and ground elements coordinated. Through resilient communication networks designed to function even under heavy electronic attack, and in a notable operation against a coalition forward base on a barren moon, human forces executed a synchronized strike in which stealth ships neutralized sensor arrays, orbital platforms suppressed offensive fire, and marine units inserted to disable power and command centers, all within a tightly choreographed time frame that left the base unable to mount an effective response. And the aftermath of this operation was not only a tactical victory but a psychological one, as captured coalition officers expressed astonishment at the speed, precision, and integration of the human assault, qualities they had not believed possible for a species so recently dismissed as technologically and strategically inferior. And back on Earth in the core human worlds, the war effort was sustained by a population that, while weary, remained remarkably unified, informed by transparent communication from their leaders and motivated by a shared understanding of what was at stake. And figures like Helen Brooks continued to ensure that production, transportation, and medical support kept pace with the demands of the front, adapting industrial output and civilian infrastructure to wartime needs without collapsing under the strain, a feat that did not go unnoticed by coalition observers who had expected social fragmentation and unrest. And as months turned into another year, the cumulative effect of human adaptability, political outreach, and operational success began to shift the strategic balance, forcing the coalition to defend a growing number of positions, to protect supply routes stretched across vast distances, and to contend with the reality that the humans were no longer merely reacting, but actively shaping the strategic environment, choosing when to strike, where to apply pressure, and how to exploit the divisions and uncertainties within their adversaries' ranks. And in the midst of these developments, intelligence surfaced of a coalition plan to concentrate remaining heavy forces for a decisive engagement near a strategically vital junction system that controlled access to several core worlds, a move born of both desperation and the belief that only a massive, unequivocal victory could restore confidence in unity. And human planners, analyzing the pattern, recognized both the risk and the opportunity, understanding that if they could blunt or turn this impending offensive, they would not only secure their own territories, but demonstrate to the galaxy that humanity had reached a level of strategic maturity and military capability that could no longer be ignored or underestimated, setting the stage for a confrontation that would test every lesson learned, every alliance formed, and every ounce of resolve the species possessed. The junction system that the coalition had chosen for its decisive stand was a sprawling nexus of hyperspace routes anchored by a yellow main sequence star and surrounded by a complex arrangement of gas giants, rocky inner worlds, and artificial habitats that served as refueling, repair, and command hubs for traffic moving between multiple sectors of the galaxy. And from a purely strategic standpoint, it made sense, because whoever controlled the system could regulate the flow of fleets and commerce across an entire quadrant. Yet for the humans, it represented something more than a crossroads. It was a place where the environment itself could be shaped into a battlefield that favored those who understood it most intimately. And long before the Coalition's armada began its final assembly, human reconnaissance units and autonomous probes had mapped every gravitational eddy, radiation pocket, and debris stream in exquisite detail, feeding that information into simulations that ran countless variations of possible engagements, each one refining predictions and revealing subtle interactions that could be exploited when the moment came. And as Admiral Garrett Voss gathered what remained his strongest formations, reinforced by newly arrived contingents from distant coalition worlds, his intent was clear. He would force the humans to commit their main fleets, overwhelm them through sheer mass and firepower, and reassert control in a single, unmistakable demonstration of dominance. But the very scale of this concentration created vulnerabilities, because coordinating such a vast, multi-species force required an enormous logistical and communication effort, one that stretched already strained networks and relied heavily on centralized planning assumptions that had repeatedly been shown to be ill-suited against an adaptive opponent and human intelligence. Monitoring the buildup through a combination of deep space sensors, intercepted transmissions, and information quietly shared by neutral systems, was able to construct a near-complete picture of coalition dispositions, including the locations of command ships, the routing of supply convoys, and the timing of fleet movements. And with this knowledge, the human high command, operating through a distributed council of senior officers and civilian leaders, approved a plan that did not seek to meet the Armada in a single, symmetrical clash, but to break its coherence before it could ever bring its full strength to bear. And the first phase of this plan unfolded in the weeks leading up to the expected engagement, as human raiding groups launched coordinated strikes against coalition supply depots, fuel processing stations, and communication relays along the approach routes to the junction system, actions that were not intended to halt the advance outright, but to introduce delays, shortages, and uncertainty, forcing the coalition to divert escorts, reroute convoys, and compress timetables, all of which increased stress on crews and commanders alike. At the same time, human cyber and electronic warfare units intensified their efforts to penetrate coalition networks, not merely to disrupt them, but to observe how information flowed, where decisions bottlenecked, and which nodes were most critical to maintaining overall coordination. And as patterns emerged, targeted disruptions were applied with surgical precision, causing momentary but strategically significant lapses in situational awareness that human planners could exploit. And when the coalition fleets finally began to converge on the junction system, they did so under conditions far less orderly than their leaders would have liked, with some formations arriving ahead of schedule, others lagging behind, and the synchronization that Voss had envisioned already beginning to fray. And it was at this point that the humans initiated the second phase, deploying a screen of mobile defense platforms and minefields that, while not immediately lethal, forced the advancing armada to slow, to alter course, and to spread out in order to safely navigate the approach, further diluting the concentration of force and creating gaps between task groups. And into these gaps slipped human strike elements, fast, well-coordinated, and operating under mission directives that emphasized disruption over destruction, targeting command and control ships, sensor pickets, and logistics vessels, striking hard and then withdrawing before heavier units could respond. And each such action forced the coalition to reconfigure its formations, to tighten here, to reinforce there, creating a constant churn of movement that eroded the clarity of Voss's overall plan. And as the main body of the Armada entered the outer reaches of the junction system, the environment itself began to assert its influence, with the gravitational interplay of the gas giants and the primary star creating regions of turbulent space, time that interfered with long-range targeting and jump calculations, conditions that human navigators, trained and equipped to operate in such complexity, could exploit to maneuver with confidence while their adversaries struggled to maintain precise positioning. And it was within this shifting, dynamic battle space that the opening exchanges of the decisive confrontation took place. As human fleets emerged from concealment in radiation shadows and planetary magnetospheres, launching coordinated salvos that struck at exposed elements of the coalition formation, testing defenses, probing reactions, and feeding real-time data back into command networks that updated plans on the fly. And although the coalition returned fire with formidable power, the very act of engaging revealed further information about weapon ranges, firing cycles, and defensive coverage, information that human analysts rapidly incorporated into refined targeting solutions, allowing subsequent strikes to become more precise and more effective. And as the hours turned into days of continuous maneuver and intermittent battle, the human approach became clear. They were not rushing toward a single climactic exchange. They were wearing the Armada down, sapping its cohesion, isolating its elements, and shaping the battle space so that when a decisive moment came, it would unfold on terms that favored human strengths in coordination, adaptability, and environmental mastery. And within the coalition, command structure. Tension mounted as reports of fuel shortages, delayed reinforcements, and mounting losses from seemingly minor but cumulatively damaging actions reached the flagship, and Admiral Voss, increasingly aware that the situation was slipping beyond the neat parameters of his original plan, faced a growing realization that he was no longer driving the course of the campaign, but reacting to an opponent who had anticipated his moves and prepared the field accordingly, a realization that marked a critical psychological shift. Because for the first time since the war had begun, the coalition's senior leadership was forced to confront the possibility that the decisive battle they had sought might not deliver the restoration of dominance they had promised, but instead become a moment when the balance of power tipped irrevocably in humanity's favor. As the decisive confrontation in the junction system intensified, the coalition armada found itself increasingly constrained by the cumulative effects of human strategy, environmental complexity, and internal strain, and what had been intended as a tightly coordinated advance now resembled a vast, unevenly stretched formation struggling to maintain coherence across immense distances, with some task groups fully engaged in heavy fighting, while others lagged behind, attempting to close gaps or respond to distress calls that arrived with growing frequency. And within this maelstrom, human commanders executed the third phase of their plan, which centered on isolating and neutralizing the coalition's command and control architecture, not through a single decapitating strike, but through a layered campaign of disruption that targeted communication relays, data fusion nodes, and the specialized vessels responsible for synchronizing fleet movements and targeting. And these efforts were supported by an intense electronic warfare offensive that flooded coalition channels with noise, false signals, and carefully crafted deceptions that mimic legitimate traffic, creating uncertainty about which orders were authentic and which were fabrications. And while alien crews worked desperately to sort signal from interference, human units, operating on pre-brief contingencies and empowered to act independently, continued to maneuver with relative freedom, exploiting windows of opportunity that opened and closed in minutes. And in one critical engagement, a human strike group led by Captain Andrew Miller, a former aerospace engineer whose deep understanding of sensor physics informed his tactical decisions, used a combination of directed energy bursts and precisely timed micro-jumps to disable a cluster of coalition relay ships, severing real-time coordination between several major formations and forcing them to rely on slower, less reliable backup links. And this fragmentation of the information network had immediate tactical consequences, as coalition units that had been accustomed to operating with a comprehensive, shared picture of the battle space suddenly found themselves isolated, uncertain of friendly positions, and hesitant to commit fully for fear of misidentification or friendly fire. And the humans exploited this hesitation, launching rapid, localized offensives that overwhelmed isolated elements before neighboring forces could effectively respond. And as more coalition ships were damaged, captured, or forced to withdraw for repairs, the logistical strain that had been building over weeks reached a critical point, with fuel and ammunition stocks running low in some formations and resupply convoys delayed or intercepted, further limiting the Armada's ability to sustain high-tempo operations. And throughout these developments, human psychological operations quietly amplified the sense of uncertainty and doubt, transmitting carefully selected information through channels likely to be intercepted, highlighting coalition losses, emphasizing human unity and resolve, and underscoring the growing number of neutral systems that were opening their ports to human vessels while restricting or denying access to coalition ships, a subtle but powerful signal that the broader political environment was shifting as well. And within the flagship of Admiral Voss, the strain was evident as staff officers worked to reconcile conflicting reports, to re-establish reliable communication with dispersed task groups, and to formulate a coherent plan for regaining the initiative. Yet every option seemed to carry unacceptable risk, because concentrating forces would leave vulnerable flanks exposed to human raiders, while dispersing further would only accelerate the loss of cohesion. And in this atmosphere of mounting pressure, Voss authorized a bold but desperate maneuver, ordering a powerful reserve formation push through the contested zone and strike directly at a cluster of human command nodes believed to be coordinating the distributed defense, hoping that a successful blow against these centers would disrupt human control and restore a measure of balance. But the intelligence on which this decision was based was already outdated, because the humans had anticipated such an attempt and had deliberately shifted key functions among multiple hardened and mobile platforms, ensuring that no single strike could cripple their command structure. And when the Coalition Reserve advanced, it encountered not a static target, but a layered defense that combined decoy installations, mobile fleets, and rapid response units, all integrated through resilient networks that allowed them to absorb the initial assault and then counterattack with speed and precision. And in the ensuing battle, the Coalition formation was drawn into a complex, multi-directional engagement in which human units exploited their superior situational awareness and coordination to isolate individual ships and small groups, overwhelming them in detail while avoiding the concentrated firepower of the larger mass. And as this reserve was gradually worn down and forced to retreat with heavy losses, the failure of the maneuver marked a turning point, because it demonstrated to both sides that the Coalition no longer possessed an uncommitted force capable of reversing the situation, and that the initiative, both operationally and psychologically, had passed decisively to humanity. And across the junction system, human fleets began to press their advantage, tightening the noose around fragmented Coalition formations, cutting off avenues of retreat, and compelling surrenders as captains recognized that continued resistance would only lead to unnecessary destruction. And as reports of these developments reached political leaders across the Coalition, the narrative of an inevitable, triumphant campaign gave way to a far more troubling assessment that the war had entered a phase in which humanity's adaptability, resilience, and strategic coherence were not merely matching Coalition power, but steadily overcoming it, and that the decisive battle they had sought was unfolding, not as a single cataclysmic clash, but as a protracted, methodical dismantling of their ability to wage war on their own terms. By the time the Junction System campaign entered its final phase, the Coalition's once formidable armada had been reduced from a unified instrument of overwhelming force into a scattered collection of battered formations, each struggling to maintain cohesion, supply, and morale, and a human command network, now operating with near-complete situational awareness, began to shift from a posture of disruption to one of systematic resolution, identifying which enemy groups could be compelled to surrender, which could be isolated and neutralized, and which still posed enough threat to require decisive engagement. And this transition was marked not by a dramatic declaration, but by a subtle change in tempo, as human task forces tightened their operational loops, coordinating strikes, interdictions, and boarding actions with increasing precision, closing off escape corridors and herding Coalition ships into regions where their options narrowed with each passing hour. And among the officers directing this phase was Admiral Susan Hart, a strategist whose career had been shaped by Coalition doctrine studies, and who understood not only how alien fleets fought, but how their command cultures process failure. And it was her assessment that the Coalition's greatest remaining vulnerability was psychological rather than material, that many of their captains still believed that if they could only regroup, if they could only reestablish a clear chain of command, the situation might be salvaged. And so human operations were designed to deny them that belief, to demonstrate again and again that every attempt to concentrate or reorganize would be detected, anticipated, and countered. And this was achieved through a relentless pattern of reconnaissance feints and targeted strikes that made it clear that no movement went unseen and no formation could gather without drawing immediate attention. And in one illustrative engagement, a Coalition battle group attempting to withdraw toward a secondary hyperspace node found its path blocked by what appeared to be a lightly defended human screen, only to discover, once committed, that the screen was a lure, drawing them into a zone where multiple human fleets converged from different vectors, supported by orbital platforms and long-range fire, creating a situation in which resistance was futile and surrender the only rational option. And as the battle group's commander transmitted his capitulation, the signal was deliberately allowed to propagate through Coalition channels, a quiet but unmistakable message that the humans were not merely destroying. They were offering an alternative to annihilation, and this approach, repeated across the battle space, began to produce a cascade of similar decisions as captains, cut off from higher authority and faced with overwhelming but disciplined opposition, chose to stand down rather than sacrifice their crews in hopeless engagements, and each surrender further, eroded the coalition's ability to mount coordinated resistance, both by reducing available forces and by undermining the confidence of those still fighting. And within the flagship of Admiral Voss, now operating under severe constraints and with communications to many subordinate units lost or intermittent, the realization set in that the campaign had crossed a threshold from which recovery was unlikely, that the strategic initiative was irretrievably in human hands, and that continued attempts to force a decisive reversal would only deepen the losses and harden the political consequences. And as this understanding spread to the upper echelons of coalition leadership, debates that had once focused on how to win the war began to shift toward how to limit its damage, how to preserve what could still be preserved, and how to prepare for a future in which humanity would have to be treated not as a peripheral species, but as a central military and political actor. And on the human side, the mood was one of controlled determination rather than triumphalism, as commanders and civilian leaders alike emphasized discipline, restraint, and the importance of maintaining the moral and strategic high ground, aware that the way this conflict ended would shape interstellar relations for generations. And so, as the final pockets of organized resistance in the junction system were surrounded and neutralized, and as the last coordinated coalition attempts to break through were repelled with decisive but measured force, it became evident to observers across the galaxy that the war the aliens had thought they would win had reached its turning point, not in a single apocalyptic exchange, but in the steady, undeniable demonstration that humanity had mastered the art of modern interstellar warfare, combining adaptability, unity, technological sophistication, and psychological insight into a coherent whole that no longer needed to prove itself through reckless destruction, because its superiority was now evident in the very fact that it could choose when to press, when to pause, and when to offer terms, shaping the end of the conflict as deliberately as it had shaped its course. In the weeks that followed the collapse of organized coalition resistance in the junction system, the strategic reality of the war became impossible to deny, because the once vast and confident armada that set out to impose upon a supposedly inferior species now lay scattered across space as surrendered vessels, in turn crews, and silent wrecks drifting in carefully controlled zones, and the human fleets, rather than advancing in uncontrolled pursuit, shifted into a posture of stabilization, securing key routes, establishing humanitarian corridors, and coordinating with neutral powers to manage prisoners, refugees, and disrupted trade, demonstrating to the wider galaxy that their objective had never been annihilation for its own sake, but the enforcement of a new balance of respect and deterrence. And in the chambers of the Galactic Council, where earlier debates had been marked by arrogance and dismissal, a very different atmosphere now prevailed as representatives confronted detailed reports of human operational competence, political cohesion, and technological integration, and were forced to acknowledge that the assumptions which had underpinned the decision to challenge humanity had been fundamentally flawed, because the humans had not only matched coalition capabilities in many areas, but had surpassed them in the crucial domains of adaptability, decentralized command, and the integration of civilian, military, and diplomatic effort into a single, resilient system. And as diplomatic channels reopened, cautiously at first and then with increasing frequency, human envoys made it clear that their species sought neither domination nor isolation, but recognition as an equal power whose security concerns and strategic interests had to be taken seriously, a message reinforced by the disciplined conduct of their forces and the transparency with which they handled the aftermath of the fighting, and within the coalition itself, political. Realignments began as member species reassessed their alliances, doctrines, and long-held beliefs about the hierarchy of galactic power, some calling for reforms that would prevent future wars born of underestimation and cultural arrogance, others advocating for renewed engagement with humanity as a stabilizing influence rather than a threat. And among the human leadership, figures like Daniel Carter, Helen Brooks, Samuel Wright, and Susan Hart did not seek personal acclaim, instead focusing on institutional lessons, codify what had worked, what had nearly failed, and how a species that had once been regarded as a marginal newcomer had, through preparation, unity, and clarity of purpose, reshaped the strategic landscape of an entire quadrant, and in academies, shipyards, and policy councils across human space. The conflict was studied not as a tale of glory alone, but as a demonstration of the cost of complacency and the necessity of constant adaptation, because the war had proven that survival in a crowded and often hostile galaxy required more than advanced weapons. It required the ability to think independently to cooperate across differences, and act decisively without losing sight of long-term consequences. And as news of the coalition's strategic withdrawal and the opening of formal negotiations spread to the farthest colonies, and to worlds that had once watched humanity's rise with skepticism or indifference, a new perception took hold that humans were no longer merely participants in interstellar affairs, but shapers of them, a species whose resilience, ingenuity, and disciplined resolve had forced the galaxy to reconsider its assumptions. And in quiet moments aboard ships returning from the front and in the rebuilt halls of diplomacy, the understanding settled in that the conflict will be remembered not for a single battle or a single hero, but for the moment when an underestimated civilization proved that it could endure pressure, learn faster than its enemies, and respond to aggression not with panic or submission, but with a coordinated, strategic, and ultimately decisive assertion of its place among the stars, ensuring that never again will the words underestimated and human be spoken together in the councils of the galaxy,